Welcome to Leading People with me, Gerry Murray. This is the podcast for HR leaders, L&D professionals and senior leaders who want to bring out the best in themselves and the people around them. Every other week, I sit down with leading authors, researchers and practitioners for deep, honest conversations about what great leadership actually looks like in practice, and how your own mindset, behaviour and presence shape everything around you. If you want thinking that challenges you, tools you can use, and conversations worth returning to, you're in the right place.
From that comes Silicon Valley. We want Silicon Valley, but we don't necessarily want the garage. But the garage is where we gain confidence alongside each other. We ask questions, we try things out. And that was always the case with those historical guilds. We've got to recapture these because they are so powerful and so cost effective.
That's this week's guest, Andy Lancaster, author, learning strategist, and a long-time voice in workplace learning. In this conversation, we explore why learning so often gets treated as an individual activity, when in reality, people usually learn best with and through other people. And in a world of AI, that may matter more than ever. Andy's new book is called Organisational Learning Communities. And this episode is all about why leaders who want better learning, more innovation, and more confidence at work may need to pay much more attention to the communities people build around their work. Let's hear what Andy has to say. Andy Lancaster, welcome back to Leading People.
Thanks, Joe, for the invite. It's brilliant to be with you, and it's a great series, so really delighted to contribute today.
Thanks. Andy, which part of the world are you coming in from today?
So I'm in West London, so I'm in Windsor. So those in the UK will probably be aware of Windsor, is where the royal family live in a very big castle on the hill. So yeah, West London. And luckily I'm not under the flight path today because it's right near Heathrow. So sometimes when we're doing these podcasts, so West London for me.
Yeah. You got good, interesting neighbours. And I remember when I lived in London all eons ago, going to Windsor Park, the park there, and actually the planes seemed to almost guide in by they'd fly in over the park, kind of guided by the pathway almost. You'd think that they were going to land in the park sometimes, they were coming in that close.
And that park on a good day is where a lot of my book writing goes on, actually. So you've connected already. That's one of my writing places. So that's cool.
That's where your writing flies high.
Yeah, one time, yeah.
If you pardon the expression. Okay, so Andy, you're a returning guest, and I was just looking before we came on the show that you were here on Leading People in May 2022, and we were talking in that particular episode mainly about how we should embrace mistakes as a very positive thing. And before we talk about your latest book, maybe please share with my listener the journey that has led you to where you are today, and were there any sort of epiphany moments, particularly related to this book that you've written? And we'll get into the title of the book and everything in a few minutes.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I think anybody who's written a book or even planning on writing, because probably some of the people listening in have got the seed of a book in them. You've got to be passionate about the topic. It's got to be something that deeply grabs you. So this whole one, and we'll unpack it a bit in a minute around community. What first grabbed me, I worked in rehab. In fact, I often say I was in rehab for 5 years, which is a great opener at parties because people look at you and just sort of think, well done for getting your life back together again. But I was head of HR and learning in one of the big UK rehab organisations, and we used community. It was called Community as Method, based on a theory by a guy called George de Leon, which positions community as a primary agent of change for each of us. And that's essentially how people often overcome some of these addiction challenges that they have. So it goes back to that season where I just realized that community is so powerful. And as we'll unpack in the conversation, in a day of increasing AI, this human connection is really important. So it goes back, probably my seed of interest came in community as method working in rehab services.
Okay, so the book is called
Organisational Learning Communities. I'd have loved to have just called it learning communities, Gerry, but the publishers have some control in this one as well. But having worked in education as well, this would work equally well in schools and colleges and wider as well. So yeah, organisational learning communities, and it's about empowering social collaboration. So that's the title. Yeah. And
so what inspired you to write this book? Oh, there it is there.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, it's a nice yellow colour. Yeah.
Yeah. So what inspired you to write this book, and who is it for, and why now?
Yeah, so why now? Definitely why now. I think we are increasingly looking for human connection right now. And I'm sure we'll unpack AI a bit in a moment. But in a world of increasing technology, I think we're all recognizing that human connection is so powerful. What's really interesting for me, when I kind of went back and you look at the history of humankind, I mean, community was how people were successful and learned. So you think about those early petrographs and cave paintings where people, worked out how to make fire and to hunt. So community was always the very natural way that people learned, developed, and succeeded. And again, as someone who qualified as a teacher initially at my career, this is the way that children learn, by watching each other and being around it. And then you just go into, I've got some evidence in the book around the natural world: bees, ants, hermit crabs, starlings, killer whales. It's just like, believe it or not, an ant doesn't have to go on an e-learning course to learn key compliance stuff. It does it in the sense of community. So for me, it was this kind of energy around, this is the natural way that we do this. And yet somehow we lost that connection. And I think we need to get it back again.
Yeah. I will be on your page already. And my own experience of delivering training and particularly incorporating some, probably not enough, but it's usually constrained by what organizations are prepared to do. Just the few things that I would use from a community point of view in a training program, even a 2-day training, would reinforce the value and the power of communities. And there's a lot of neuroscience around social learning anyway. I mean, you can find that just sharing stuff and debating stuff. So in what ways are learning communities so powerful, particularly in an organizational context then?
Yeah, I mean, I distilled it down into 5 key ones. So I think, and I'm sure those listening in, at least one of these will resonate in terms of how we can connect to make this really happen. So first one was around sharing knowledge. I mean, there's some great thinking around James Saricki's The Wisdom of Crowds, about how none of us is as smart as all of us. I think that's a Ken Blanchard quote. So this whole connection piece around sharing knowledge, and often in organizations we have this siloed knowledge. We have experts who maybe don't share that knowledge, sometimes intentionally because of the power of knowledge, but sometimes there's sheer busyness. So there's definitely a place where communities and we know communities of practice, which are only one aspect of this. That's an interesting one, Gerry, that when I talk to people about community, everybody naturally drops into thinking about communities of practice, but again, there's a variety of those. So sharing knowledge is another one. Spearheading practice is a second one. In the UK, if we look back historically, there have been these guilds which have been responsible for developing practice, and these have been socialised organisations. These go back to stonemasons and all these kind of amazing careers that people had. But again, they develop people from apprentices to what we call journeymen or women into experts through community. So again, we see practice historically has always been in the context of community. 3 other quick ones: solving problems. It's very interesting that solving problems alone is very difficult, and especially in our day of wicked problems, complex problems, that it's proven now, and the evidence shows that solving problems together is really important. Innovation, again, very similar. I came from a technologies background, having lectured at university, and most innovation is seen in the context of community. That's where great ideas. In fact, we think about Apple. Fascinating. Well, we all want to be maybe we don't all want to be, but we all aspire to see the innovation that the Apple Foundation and Corporation has. But it began in a garage in Menlo Park. This was a few people who met in a garage. So I think that's another one around innovation. The last one, I made it last in my list, is about supercharging development, because we do see the natural way for people to develop is through community. And just to your point, it's really interesting that often what I found is community is added on as something to a program, whereas going back to my experiences in rehab, community was the method. And I think the heart of the book is that we should treat community as the method, not as an add-on.
Yeah, because I suppose one of the first things that comes in my head when you say that is that it contextualizes the learning almost, because it's quite likely that everybody in the community is on some sort of journey related to what whatever that is that they're learning to do, whether it's in a department, a team, or even it's cross-functional, but they're on a similar learning path. It struck me as well, you talked about knowledge, and I suppose one of the thoughts that came into my head, I'm going back to my early career in that, and sort of the way things were done. Knowledge, I guess people didn't like to share it because it was seen as a source of power. But today it's so ubiquitous, and Google and then the AI versions of whether it's Gemini or ChatGPT or that. I mean, knowledge is no longer, like you cannot. It's really impossible to have exclusive knowledge. Maybe you have momentary knowledge that you can use, but it doesn't last very long. So what's the point in trying to hoard it up? It'll just be like cheese. It'll just start to smell and go off, basically. So, and then you talk about practice guilds and problems. This is all such amazing. Actually, it's almost obvious stuff.
It is
in many ways, and yet, Isn't it amazing how the obvious has somehow got flittered away through a desire to be more efficient and save money and all sorts of other things.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And sometimes it is about revisiting our roots, isn't it? And when I actually did the research for the book of these worshipful guilds, the most amazing ones, found the Worshipful Guild of Launderers. This is as in people who did laundry, and they had their own practice skills, which they shared together. So there was something intrinsic about it, that you hang around with people who have got same motivations. And that's why if we look at something like Mumsnet as outside of the organisation, it matters because my kid won't eat broccoli or my child won't sleep. Therefore, you're connecting at quite a deep level because you're actually trying to solve problems or share information on these kind of things. So I guess what I found was that in many organizations, these communities, I called it, they're incidental. You find them, they happen. A group of people hang together, or there's a WhatsApp group or something. So I wanted to move from that to intentionality, where we actually are purposely leveraging communities, as I saw in rehab. So yeah, you're right. Information is ubiquitous now, but I think what isn't is the contextualization of that, which is where community is so important. That together we can stew on stuff and chew it over and work out how to apply it. So I think that's best done in the context of community.
Yeah. Okay. So I think a lot of this is we're going to keep coming back to these themes now over the next, let's say 30 minutes of this conversation. So I have a question here. It's almost like a contextual framing, and it relates to the basic theme of this podcast. Why should leaders embrace and encourage learning communities, and how should they do this or go about it?
Yep. So again, I think we invest time and resource into things that we know are valuable. And I think we are so busy in organizations that sometimes we just miss the tricks on this one. So for leaders, in days where many organizations have got very pressed budgets, this is a very cost-effective way of doing this. I've run some book clubs, a community. You're finding book clubs popping up in organizations. So for the price of a piece of fruitcake and a cup of tea, you have a very, very powerful method of, as we've said, of sharing knowledge or solving problems or seeding innovation. So I think for leaders, this is cost effective, and it is definitely effective. So I think we need to recognize. Now, the challenge is, if you say, I'm just going to gather with a few people and have a cup of tea, that's seen as a waste of time often. We haven't got time to be doing this kind of stuff. But that is the very place, if we go back to Apple, in that garage in Menlo Park was where a few people gathered together and they trace the origins of Silicon Valley to that garage. That's just incredible for me. So I think leaders, it's waking up to the fact that when people connect, that we do great stuff. So cost effective, it definitely moves the dial. And I think as well, not everybody can work remotely because obviously people in customer service or hospitality or manufacturing have to be in the actual company or in the workplace. But in this day of AI, we've got to solve this one, that we are becoming fragmented as communities. And I think this, for leaders, this is how we gather the organization as a very powerful community.
Yeah. We'll be right back after this short break. If you're finding value in this conversation, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And perhaps share this episode with a colleague who'd find it useful. Word of mouth is how good podcasts grow. And if you'd like to be part of the conversation beyond the podcast, I'd love to have you in the Leading People community, a growing group of HR leaders, L&D professionals and experienced leaders who gather regularly for live sessions, discussions, and the kind of thinking you've been hearing today. You'll find the details in the show notes. And just as you talk about that, a couple of things pop into my mind, and one of them is that how insight works. It's like, the neuroscience on how the brain processes, like, yes, you're focused on a problem, you're trying to solve it, and often I think it was used to say that Einstein said he always found his ideas in the 3 Bs: the bed, the bus, and the bath,
Nice.
And,
yeah.
And it's like, I was reflecting that I can't think of one Leading People conversation where I didn't learn something new just because of the bounce back and forth with my guest. And it also reminds me of the Swedish people's tendency to do this thing called fika in the afternoon. Now, I know that it's a getting together for some tea or coffee and a cake or whatever. And I know it's not about work. However, it's quite likely that some of those conversations, because they're just relaxed, are going to stimulate something in, everybody knows this. That's the interesting thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I have this question here about learning communities sound obvious to use, but anyone facilitating them knows that they're challenging. So what kind of key things underpin successful learning communities in your experience?
Yeah, and this was a really interesting one. So the book was came out of a sketchbook. So I trained as a designer originally. We used to keep sketchbooks as we used to be assessed on our sketchbook, gathering ideas. So actually, if somebody listening in might just want to revisit journaling, very powerful way of doing this. So I started collecting ideas where I saw these communities working well, because my experience is they are quite tricky. And I'll give an example in the book where NASA, you'd think if anybody could have cracked a socialized learning environment, NASA would do it, but they struggled massively. I won't go into all the reasons, you can read it in the book, but they eventually had this community which was meant to be reaching tens of thousands of people, but actually they were getting like 14 logons a week or something like that. So you suddenly realize, and those of us who've run these, and it isn't as obvious as it looks. So I started collecting the DNA of successful communities, and I'll just punt out. I found 7 things. There are probably more, but 7 things, which I've called my 7 C's. So very quickly, this is what energizes communities. This is what makes them really work. So firstly, cause I've got at the center. It has to have some kind of energy. We go back to Mum's Net. My child want to eat broccoli. There's a reason why I want to connect with others. And what we see is, again, in guilds, there is a clear common purpose. So we need to think about friction, about solving issues. There's a whole thing around culture, about creating a very supportive environment, but particularly on culture, psychological safety, where people are free to be themselves and to ask the tough questions and also to be vulnerable. So culture is really important. There's some things around culture about, again, how much we can overmanage these communities. A little bit. And the third one is conditions C. Well, this is also about face-to-face, digital or hybrid. So there's some really good evidence around, to your fika point, actually meeting in the right environment is really important. And I used to have some of my team meetings in museums exactly for that reason, that it was an inspiring environment. Fourth one is cadence. Every community that I found that worked had a rhythm about it. And this is the same for sports communities or faith communities. You'll find that there is a rhythm. So to set a community up and just expect it's going to survive and thrive just doesn't happen. So we need to think about both synchronous and asynchronous interactions. Next one's content. The communities that were really buzzing, updated, they posted information, they shared insights. So that was really important. Contributions. Often we find communities are not very active. We've got very small numbers of people. So there's things like working out loud and enabling people to see what we're doing. And lastly, the 7th one is credit. That was really interesting that many communities now have recognitions around being a member of those. So if you think about TripAdvisor, from day one, you get a badge, you get a recognition for being a valued part of that community. And we're now seeing things like micro-credentialing appearing. So those 7 C's, you don't have to have all of them, but cause, culture, conditions, cadence, content, contributions, and credit. Those are the things that made the communities work, where we found that they really worked. Those were very important conditions to have, and things that we overlook at our peril.
Well, if I don't know what any of my listeners are doing out there, if I try those on, and particularly if anybody listening has had an experience of a community which is either working well or hasn't worked well, I find these are incredibly pertinent. We run a community for a large client where we take them through an accreditation process to learn how to use some talent assessment software. And I learned this from some training in how to make training transfer to the workplace. And we just call it a cafe. And once a month, 1 hour. And what we learned along the way, just to reflect on that, what you've talked about is real here. What was the cause or the purpose was to help people refine what they'd learned in the training course and to bring their questions as they started to use this in their day-to-day. The content became quite important. We thought we could just let it run, like if it was there, people would come. But we found that we needed to theme the cafes, because people would ask themselves, what's in it for me to give up that hour in the morning to go to that? So as long as there was a sense that they would go there, and getting back to your content, the label of learning communities, as long as there was something that they felt they might learn, people would turn up. And the other thing, the only interesting one, was getting contributions from the members of the community. So we are the outside people with the expertise. It hasn't been so easy to get them to bring the stuff into the environment. Now, that might be a cultural thing. I don't know about, putting that stuff in. We've had a few people contribute some fantastic stuff. I'm not sure whether they've got a credit system in place. That's just a small example.
So
I can identify with every one of those 7 C's, and I can even go after this conversation and I'll have a long look at that to see whether we could improve it.
But it's like when you say them, they seem so obvious, but I've designed some disastrous communities which were, they had energy for a few weeks and then they just disappeared, vaporized. So I think with like all simplistic things, it does, great things, simplicity really matters. But to your point about contributions, it's really interesting because you do get this, there's this theory, it's a bit oversimplified, but 99-1. So 90% of the community are kind of lurkers, hang around, just watch. And I'm a lurker right now, actually, in a few communities, so I'm one of those. You then get 9% who are quite active, and only 1% are really driving the community with contributions. So we've got to think about how we do that. Now, what I've found, Gerry, is John Stepper's theory about working out loud is the DNA of how we do this. Now, what I've found is that people sometimes think what they know is too simple, but it isn't. Something that you do naturally and simply is just revelation for me. So part of this is validating people's contribution. But Stepper's working out loud, I do that as a principle. I tend to do that on LinkedIn. Sometimes I even crystallize my thoughts. But this is where community happens, that we begin to talk and discuss. So there's definitely tactics in the book around intentionality, around how you do that kind of, and it probably comes back a little bit to culture as well, Gerry. The psychological safety, we can't underestimate that. If you've got something going on where you're struggling, you've got to feel safe to do that. So again, many of these 7 C's, they kind of overlap a little bit.
I'm going to give you an 8th C now. So when you update the book, because this community that I'm talking about is running since the middle part of 2021. So we're almost 6 years on it. And I'm going to suggest you don't have to have it. A continuity.
Nice. Yeah.
See, there we go.
Version 2 of the book is but that's perfect. It's in community that you and I are already innovating here, and so that's great. Yeah, fantastic. Go for it. Okay,
so let's put ourselves in the shoes of somebody listening to this, and they're going, "Okay, I get it. The guys are making a strong case." So, what do you see as the most common difficulties that people have to address? So supposing somebody's saying, you know what, I think this is a great idea. I'm working in learning and development. Or I could be just a manager who looks around a team and says, you know what, I think we're not harnessing enough of, we could get a lot more cohesion. Sorry, there's another C for you. We get a lot more cohesion out of this group around our performance and that if we were in a more of a community context. So, oh my God, there's another C, context. Right. So you have to write another couple of books and get the stage. So what are some of the most difficult things? So somebody who might want to go about doing this now, what would you advise them to do at the beginning before maybe even set up the community?
Yeah, so I would go. So in the model, it's a sort of hexagon. I made it a hexagon shape because it was like a beehive. It just kind of worked for me. So at the center, Gerry, is cause. So all the C's matter, and we can add continuity to that. But there's no doubt that the ones that I've pioneered and designed, which have not failed, have not got a strong enough DNA for being there. So here's an example. We're running a management development program. We think, we'll tag a community onto the management development program. That's too nebulous. So what you find is actually, to your point, it's about focusing in very, very specifically, and that's where you look at things like guilds work because they're very practice focused. So I think the starting point is to get the cause sorted out. And I'm really passionate about writing community charters, not massive documents, but a one-pager to say, this is what this community is all about. This is what we are meeting. This is what we expect you. We can put some stuff around culture there. Now, what I often look for is the friction. In customer service, when we're trying to improve things, we look at the friction points where things aren't necessarily working as well as they could. So for those listening in, go and have a look where the friction is. There might be something, for instance, around onboarding, which is tricky. We might be getting turnover in certain departments. Here's, absolute free tip on this one. Why not have a socialized onboarding program rather than just giving people policies and events and things like that? We actually look at the whole thing about making the onboarding socialized. So friction, I think, is a really crucial one. And I think over managing these communities can squeeze the life out of them as well. And we've got to be very careful about the dynamics with managers and senior leaders sometimes coming in on these. Not saying they shouldn't be part of these, but vulnerability, we know psychological safety is really crucial. So those are the two I think I'd start with. Be crystal clear. What are we trying to achieve here? And also communities. You mentioned continuity. They don't have to go on forever. Some communities can run for 8 weeks or activities, and then that's it. So I think we've got to be really laser focused on what we're trying to achieve through those social interactions.
And another thing then that probably emerges from what you're saying now is you talk about the merits of naturally occurring learning communities. So not trying to force them or what have you learned about those and where have you seen those emerge and then take a life of their own and work very well?
Yeah, perfect. This is really important, Gerry. So thanks for prompting on that one. In every organisation, there are communities already established, informal communities by the water cooler in the coffee area. I've even seen them in the bathrooms where people are having conversations. So these communities absolutely exist. So often they are absolutely based around this friction or solving a problem. So another great place to start is to go and spot where the communities are already happening. Now, that's not for us as people professionals or leaders to go and trample all over. It's a bit like someone's having a party and you walk in and take it over. But what we ought to be doing is at least resourcing and validating those communities. So you can often see that. I saw a really brilliant one around mental health support and well-being. Not that the organisation, I won't obviously say which organisation it was, not that the organisation didn't care, but there were a group who had similar experiences and had a safe place where they could go and just talk about how they were doing. It was a men's group, actually, Gerry. I think sometimes, men particularly maybe struggle around some of this kind of stuff. We can't gender stereotype on this one, but a very powerful small unit of guys who are talking about their mental health. So I think just have a look around. You will soon spot them. We could even ask within the organisation, we're really valuing socialised learning and connections. If you're involved in something, let us know. But I think it's about resourcing and not taking those over. Yeah, that's a good starting place.
So allow them to flow, basically.
Yeah. Often they lack resource, Joe. This is the issue. So, these things have got a life of their own. But how cool if we lightning example. When I went to my manager, this is when I was at CIPD, and said there was a certain restrictions about us meeting as a team in the building because it kind of just got us into a very particular mindset around this. So we went into, I said, museums. London museums. We held our team meetings in museums, but it costed. I had to buy the coffees and the cake, and it was like, well, hang on a minute, you can't buy coffees and cake. I mean, you can do this at the office where the coffee's free, but you suddenly realise the price of one round of coffees and a few bits of cake in an environment which inspires creative thinking is worth its weight in gold. So sometimes I think this is about resourcing those communities and helping them.
Yeah. Actually, a thought that just pops into my mind is from my own experience. A lot of people listening know that I have been a kind of professional musician as my alter ego for most of my life. And I look at some of the evolution of bands, for example. And, many bands that are, you try to form them because you say we have to have this and this and this in it. They don't work as well as the band that emerges from a jam session in the corner of a pub, where a bunch of people just come together because they have a common interest in playing music. They start playing together, and then they realize there's a chemistry, and that chemistry could be taken somewhere. And then one of them gets a call, could you do a gig? And all of a sudden they say, I'll just ask a few of my mates from the bar, and all of a sudden they have a band, So these things can emerge just very naturally rather than forcing them. And I think we have loads of examples of this in you say book clubs or classics as well. What keeps a book club together? It's this common interest in a certain type of book, and it's a social thing where people get together and, they meet each other, they see each other, they catch up on life, etc. So there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, and a cheeky plug here. I actually run a book club on organisational learning communities. It's a cost. I mean, offering that. I mean, there is a little bit of cost because I've obviously got to take the time to do that. But we found I've just done this ran this with a major global logistics company. We actually did a book club on organisational learning communities, which was kind of very meta, a community talking about communities. But no, you're right. But I think it's interesting, your music one. I mean, I grew up in the punk era, although I was a good lad. So I was being respectful to the family, didn't get heavily into, although Doc Martens are key for me now. But it was really interesting. Those punk groups came out of more than music. It was culture and connection. It was about politics. It was about identity. So, when you see people gathering around music, this is a bigger deal than just playing the notes. This is about being part of something. And that's why communities in organisations are so important, because you are part of something that really matters to you.
Yeah, totally agree. And this is interesting. I wouldn't have expected this. However, the music analogy and metaphor actually leads us into this next major topic. I was listening to the Boss Class Economist podcast there recently, and I'm a big fan of it. And Andrew Parma, who presents, has been on the Leading People show here, talking about what he learned from that. And the recent series, they've done a lot on AI. And one of there's one little excerpt where they interview a guy who actually writes his music using AI. And I suppose the thing was he was quite comfortable with it. He said it's not just asking ChatGPT to give me some notes and some words. It takes a lot of time. He says it can still take as long. However, he's leveraging the technology. But the thought, and I suppose the guys might have mentioned it, is like, would you queue around the block to watch some robots on stage, that live gig you want to go to? Or do you still prefer it to be human beings on stage and all that stuff, those human flaws that make the attending a show a very special
Here's a really interesting thing on AI, Joe. I mean, this is so we're all talking about large language models. Why are they large? Because there's millions of us connecting through technology. So we're feeding these things. So in one sense, it's a human community, isn't it? I mean, it is making intelligent links and things beyond we could do. But in one sense, our connection through large language models is a community-based thing. So for me, I did a podcast a few months ago on authoring books and what about AI and authoring. There's no doubt that in writing, there is part of the joy and the discipline is the process of writing, not doing it fast. So I think where AI for me, particularly around communities, really helps. I mean, obviously around productivity and heavy lifting, that's often where it really happens. So AI can help communities. Often the people who run communities, this is only part of their job. So there's many ways that AI can support a community, and that's where it's really, really smart to be leveraging the technology alongside the communities.
And I suppose I want to get into this a little bit more depth around AI, because I know you've written some papers and you've been reviewing a lot of research on this around AI learning being more of a cultural challenge, not just a skills challenge. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the dynamic of how AI learning is playing out in an organizational context. And I know you talk about confidence, for example, and how that might be even addressed through the community lens. You're listening to Leading People with me, Gerry Murray. My guest this week is Andy Lancaster. Coming up, why learning to use AI is as much a cultural challenge as a skills one, and why confidence, safety, and community matter more than many organizations realize. Stay with us.
Yeah, it's a really important one, isn't it? I think AI, we're trying to wrestle down how this really does work in organizations. So for me, AI is, in terms of learning and developing AI skills, this is as much a cultural challenge as a skills one, because in many organizations, we're still not sure what we're allowed to do. So people are nervous about using it. In some cases, we're being locked down and we can't use it. And that might be for good reasons around risk. So I think there's a quiet emotion involved with AI learning where we've got to help people to feel safe. They are able to make mistakes. Now, community, again, we talked about psychological safety. It's really vital that people feel that they can make those mistakes. And I think it's also about understanding that this must be contextual for our individual pathways. I need to feel that I can apply it in what I'm doing. So I think it's a bigger deal. This is not, I mean, you're beginning to see interesting things cropping up, technical skills in AI technical literacy. That isn't necessarily the big deal for me. The big deal is how we emotionally and psychologically and culturally embrace new technology. Yeah, and community can do that. I mean, that's a great place to try things out, isn't it? Where we together walk the route and recognize how we might be using AI to really help with productivity or heavy lifting.
Mm. And in the context of learning, because I personally I'm really passionate about, like you are, about learning and how we can facilitate it and make it easier for people. Like teaching is one thing, learning is really the outcome of whatever kind of teaching or instruction you've gone through. One of the things that over the years I would have worked with, and I want to touch on this now in relation to the AI, is, I would have looked at performance, and this is not my necessarily my own stuff, but through, if somebody's performing ability, you would say there's the 3 A's. There's the ability aspect, there's the attitude aspect, and then there's the allowed. Are they allowed to do it, thing? And I could see that in the article you wrote. And one of the things that's so often misunderstood about ability and attitude is that they're not kind of exclusive. There's this little bridge that goes from ability. So when people think of ability, they think of, well, has he got the skills? Like, even if we took a musical instrument, can he play the chords? However, often ability has 2 more dimensions in it, and one of those is confidence. Like, okay, he can play the chords in his bedroom, but he doesn't feel so comfortable if you put him in front of 5 people or 50 or 500 people. And then there's the volition thing, like, and so now you're crossing from the ability thing into the attitude. And you talk a lot about this confidence gap, in particularly relation to AI, and you talk about it and how it can be detrimental to an organization's ability to learn if they're not, first of all, aware of it, and then understand or are prepared to explore and address it. Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So vulnerability is the core of learning, isn't it? When we're learning something, it means that we're not on top of it already, or we want to get better at it. So, so that comes back to the pod we originally did around mistake-based learning. This is so crucial that people feel they can make a mistake. And sometimes we create these very controlled, sterile environments where you can't do that. Now, the risk around AI is clearly that, there's a risk around data, there's a risk around IP, all those kind of things. But the danger is that we then allow the risk audit department to control what we can actually do. Now, there's ways of doing this. So we can create sandboxes and closed environments where we can try things out. So I think if we come back to that, let's kind of bring these things together. If you look at young children in socialized learning, they learn together, they watch each other, they see someone make a mistake, they make a mistake. This is how socialized learning goes back to Albert Bandura and that social learning theory. So in some ways, we've got to create environments where people are allowed to make mistakes and try things out. And I think we've created organizations where we want innovation. CEOs desperately want innovation, but they don't create the environments where people can make those mistakes. So I think for me, that's important. Community, what a brilliant place to learn, where you can ask questions. And if we have got psychological safety, we can ask vulnerable questions. I wasn't quite sure why I did that, and this seemed to work, but I didn't understand why. So I think maybe there's a great community around AI skills development where we can share our, what we've learned and those kind of things. So there is no doubt in my mind that being able to have a go is a vital part. And to your point, you learn the chords, but then sometimes you've got to break the ice and sit down with the band and do it in front of someone else. That's a vulnerable place, but hey, let's do it together, because that's a much more comfortable place to innovate and to try things out.
Yeah, you actually remind me of the AI thing. I mean, I'm a part of various trainer networks and trainer communities that, work. Let's say we're doing 8 or 10 parallel sessions on the same topic together. And actually, you brought me back to, a few of the guys were more up to speed on AI. I remember us having some conversations probably 2 years ago. We'd have these trainer meetings, and myself and another guy, we were kind of into the AI thing, as much just to understand it and partly the curiosity with the technology, but also what can it help you do? And we would have been sharing some things with other people in the room who were like, for whatever reason, it wasn't in their orbit at that point in time. They knew it was there, but they weren't really tinkering with it or that. But what was remarkable was talking to each other maybe in the hallway later in the day or 2 days later, and them going, you know what? You know what you guys were talking about the other day? I went off and I was blown away. I tested out what you guys were talking about. And so all of a sudden, you had this sense of, and can you tell me a bit more kind of thing, And then others coming in and saying, I played with it and I discovered this. And even some of us who are more, let's say, advanced in our looking at it, were going, oh, because there was always something. Nobody has the perfect knowledge of this stuff. No. Everybody has this ability to bounce ideas, and you could sense this groundswell of, wow, this is something we could work with as trainers to help us be better trainers. Yeah, that's an amazing experience to be in.
It totally is, and let me take that back to Apple. Menlo, a garage in Menlo Park. You can find the picture. It's a garage. Where Wozniacki and all those guys kind of met and swapped bits. And apparently they used to go down to a supermarket after and have a coffee, But they were spurring each other on. And from that comes Silicon Valley. Yeah, we want Silicon Valley, but we don't necessarily want the garage. There's a quote for you. Should have put that in the book. That's a corker.
Is this edition two?
Yeah, here we go. We've already got version 2. But maybe that's one for folks to reflect on. We want Silicon Valley, but we don't necessarily want the garage. But the garage is where we gain confidence alongside each other. We ask questions, we try things out. And that was always the case with those historical guilds. You hung around. If you were a stonemason, a trainee man or woman, you hung around a cathedral or whatever you were building, a town hall, and together you worked on this and you asked questions. So this is why community, we've got to recapture these because they are so powerful and so cost effective.
Yeah, and in some parts of Europe, they just taking the concept of the guild, like for example, Germany, they have always had the apprenticeship model ingrained in, particularly in their factory systems and that. And it is a badge of honor to go to technical school and part-time work, working in the factory, getting day release, and honing your skills to eventually become the master person. And there's a sense of bonding. You talked about the badge, the credit. There's a sense of bonding of moving through the levels and being seen as competent, And if we go back even to the work of people like Will Schultz and that around, people need to feel significant, competent, and liked. It's a psychological need we have, and these communities of learning can feed that need.
Yeah. I mean, I trained as an instructional designer, so we always talked about spiral curriculums, where you go up and you start at a lower level and gradually you go up and up and up. I put a concept in the book called a spiral community, which is essentially what a guild is. You start at the bottom with quite simple stuff, but you are in a community with people who are at a higher level, who are able to mentor you, coach you, and bring you through. So there's no doubt that that's a very rich place. You made me this is why I love these conversations with you, Gerry. You made me think. My grandfather, who's no longer alive, he trained as a apprenticeship pattern maker. He was an engineer. And I remember Granddad saying, I sat on a stool for quite a few months, but I was around the experts and I watched and I just soaked it up. So that's so cool. So yeah, maybe what we've got to do, I guess, coming back almost to where we started, this is about intentionality. This is about using this intentionally, not incidentally. And maybe we are recapturing some of the things about apprenticeships, about communities, all those kind of things. Maybe we're waking up, maybe the world of AI, maybe even some of the fragmented relationships we experienced through a pandemic, which now seems an age ago. But we're now recognizing that being together is really important, which is why just having conversations with you is just very cool.
Okay, are you ready for it? Another question.
Yeah, go for it.
What would an AI learning spiral look like?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I think for me, I would consider myself fairly low down on it. I am using it quite a lot, but this comes back to confidence again, doesn't it? I think I probably know quite a bit about AI, but the confidence is what I'm trying to gain here and how to use this really efficiently and rigorously. But do I hang around with people who are experts in this? I absolutely do. I won't put any particular names out because I'm probably going to miss someone out. But on LinkedIn, I hang around on LinkedIn communities. So my spiral community I'm probably midway, I guess. I'm kind of using it. But then in conversations, I was at a conference yesterday. We were chatting about this over a coffee again. And I was talking about how I'd processed a load of reports. And put the PDFs in there, and it would have taken me days previously to read these, and it was helping me to do that. So so the spiral curriculum or the spiral community is get alongside the experts who are creating the thinking and the reports. Hang around with those people. There's some great books that have come out, but then develop your own practice. But then be in relationships with others where we can talk about how we can use this. I'm particularly interested in consulting as well because I'm also a consultant and I provide those services for organisations. My goodness, how AI is changing the consultant's role! It's just genius.
So here's a little tip for you and others out there. You might have tried this already. I had this idea last year, and I was using ChatGPT quite a bit, and I was kind of interested. At one stage, it sort of kind of told me that it knew a lot about me, and it was quite fascinating when I asked it. I didn't use it, but I asked it, what would a Wikipedia entry look like? I don't have one, but and it was quite fascinating because it remembered stuff. I found stuff out about me that I'd forgotten. However, what I did do, and this is the tip, is I said, okay, so I've got to know you now. That sounds strange, but I got to know you over the last 2 years or so. How would you rate me on my AI skills, and what would I need to do to get better at it?
Nice.
And it did.
And you got some smart stuff back.
It's told me how it would, give me like 2 or 3 or 4 levels. And then it said, you're in here transitioning to there. And this is what you could do to, get to that level. And it's even just, that kind of interaction. So it's like, then you might be thinking, well, who do I know that could be at that level who might have some tips for me to get there? Although, you know what? I think if you go back and ask ChatGPT or something, or whichever Claude or whoever you're using, he might or she might or it might. My wife last night said to me, she said, she has given me an answer. And I said, who was she? She said, ChatGPT. And I said, she? Now she's German,
nice.
so she thinks in terms of die, der, and das. There's the
Yeah,
female,
yeah,
the male, and so we were joking. I was saying, well, I hope I haven't graduated. I haven't ended up in I hope I'm still there. Like that's the male version of the pronoun. But so maybe if you ask the ChatGPT or whatever,
perfect.
You get your answer back.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting. Just to throw this one in. An example of an organisation really leveraging communities and technologies is Bloomberg. So they support excellence and innovation around financial systems and stats, those kind of things. Bloomberg actually have used communities in order to stay on top of technology, fast-moving technology. So they've created a guild system where things like machine learning, natural language processing, all those kind of stuff, there are groups that gather around those expertise things. And the primary reason is they want to stay at the front edge of what's going on. So staff are working out loud, they're sharing their kind of thinking. So it's really interesting that if we want to be effective in AI, maybe being in community, not being isolated, but being around people is how we actually develop those skills.
Yeah. And this conversation, we'd have to have it again. It'll probably be out of date in the next 6 months because something else will happen and that. But I think it's useful to be exploring these things for anybody out there, particularly as they talk about it being a threat to jobs and that. And then the debate is, well, maybe it's not a threat to your job per se. It might not replace you. However, if you don't know how to use these tools, and then you get back into other tools available, is it safe to use them? Can you experiment? All the great things that you put in your that you've been talking about. So coming to the end of the conversation, I mean, we could stay here all day, I think, Andy. So coming to the end, if my listener could take away just one big idea from you today, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think it's moved from the incidental to the intentional. So don't just tag communities onto other things. Make them the primary source of how we do it. And that takes me right back to where we opened, Gerry, back working in rehab services. That community was method. That's how it works. So rather than thinking, we'll tack something on, think about community as the vehicle for developing capability, for spearheading innovation, solving problems. So I think that's my keyword. And that's the nature. Yeah, the whole jolly thing is around design these things. We can create wonderful communities rather than just hoping that they might work.
Great. So how can people contact you? I'll put links in the show notes. And how can people contact you? And do you have any special offers for all the listeners who've stayed to the end?
Yeah, and thank you for those who are staying, because these are busy lives here, and really appreciate you being part of the conversation. And I've learned some stuff coming out of this, Jay, which we didn't expect would even go on, which is great. Yeah, link with me on LinkedIn would be great. So yeah, please do that, and just mention that you've been listening to the Leading People podcast with Gerry and I. That would be great to do that. So link with me on there. A couple of things definitely can do. I have a really good discount which I get as an author for the book. So that's 30%. So if you're interested in designing communities, if you ping me on LinkedIn, DM me and we'll connect, I can give you the discount code for that one. And the other one as well is, if you are interested, I do run this as a book club. We've had some brilliant book clubs around this, so I'm very happy to host one. Those will be virtual. Host one of those with you and your community or your organisation. So look forward to connecting on LinkedIn. And Gerry, thank you for the opportunity to come on here. Love Leading People podcast. It's a great one, and really appreciate having the space to talk about designing learning communities.
The check is in the post.
Thank you.
So Andy Lancaster, thanks a million for sharing your insights, tips and wisdom with me and my listener here today. And that's it for this episode of Leading People. If you're new here and enjoyed today's conversation, I'd love it if you subscribed. It's the best way to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you're a regular listener, the best recommendation is always a personal one. So, if this episode made an impact on you, please share it with a friend or colleague. It might just be the best thing they listen to this week. Until next time.